So our next speaker, we are very, very, very lucky to have Dr. Stephanie Hart from Boise State. Right. And she's going to be talking about hydro, which is something we actually haven't talked a lot about over the last couple of days. So we thought it would be really interesting just to get a different perspective on hydropower and what's going on in the US market. So I'm going to hand over to Stephanie, who's an absolute guru in this area. Take it away.
Great. And you can hear me and see my screen?
Yes. Thank you.
Good. Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really enjoying listening to the talks, and I appreciate being able to participate. As Penny said, I am going to be talking today about the hydroelectric system in the Pacific Northwest. And I've been studying regional markets in the United States, resource planning and transition decision making over the past few years, and looking at the challenges that we have. And I've been thinking a lot about, I come at this from a policy perspective and thinking about how institutional design, who gets to make decisions, what those rules look like, how governance really affects real world outcomes like the investments in low carbon technologies, reliability, and affordability. Some of my recent work has been looking at what's been going on here and around the world to really rethink the processes for resource adequacy and transmission planning, with this understanding that the way we plan our systems, and in particular the most recent work I've been doing, is this focus on matching kind of single seasonal peak demand and supply is insufficient, and all of these efforts that are going on to think about new ways of planning to make sure that we have resource adequacy has been interesting, both in terms of the technical challenges, but also the decision-making processes. This failure to really think about resource adequacy in a more complex way was identified as a big contributor to the problem with the Texas winter storms. I mean, the gas plants froze, there were all sorts of problems with resources, but fundamentally there are questions about, it was really a failure in the system planning and how they looked at it. The same kind of conclusions have been drawn from some of the rolling blackouts that we've experienced in California, this just most recent winter storm in the Northeast and the challenges that they faced, and that we really need to be thinking about how we plan for resource adequacy and the related planning for transmission in new ways. And so we've been looking at resource adequacy. We're also kind of in the midst of looking at different ways of thinking about transmission. Sorry, that kind of skipped forward. So this slide is showing a quote from a recent Federal Energy Regulatory Commission comment on their rules, that the magnitude of the resource shifts right now are overwhelming the current processes. And the way we plan the systems that, yes?
Can you just reshare your screen?
Oh,
your beautiful face at the moment, which is lovely.
Okay. It says does it work?
Just stop and then restart. It worked first time.
Okay, okay. I'm glad. Thank you for telling me. Let's see.
I think you're looking remarkably good for somebody who I know has just got a very long flight. So.
Thank you. I'm still a little bit on Sydney time, so that's helping me today. Okay, is that working?
Perfect.
Okay. So anyways, all I was kind of saying is that we really, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has 3 open dockets taking in comments on how they can do transmission planning differently. They have a number of kind of related technical conferences and dockets going on in that, and there's a lot of attention to thinking about how we can do this better. From my perspective and the kind of the background that I'm coming from, and I'm just going to ask because I moved slides. Are you seeing the slides still now?
Yep.
Okay, good. Like the background and the kind of theoretical perspective that is interesting to me is that when you have this kind of transformative shift in a complicated system, it makes it really hard to figure out how to design your institutions and rules and governance so that you can continue to move towards this really big changes in the energy system, but have resilient and adaptive institutional designs. And so that's part of what kind of motivates me in thinking about this. And it's certainly something we're seeing in the United States with both resource adequacy planning and transmission planning. So if you look at regional transmission planning in the United States, we have a patchwork of systems, and you've probably seen this slide, but the colored areas are the regional transmission organizations that are authorized by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They're responsible for operating multilateral markets. They're responsible for transmission planning and for operations. You can see that there are large parts of the United States that do not participate in these multilateral projects. Those include the Southeast as well as most of the West, and the Pacific Northwest here, which is really dominated by a hydro system. I'm here in Idaho. This is where I live, and we are very much centered in that hydroelectric system. But part of what I wanted to highlight with this slide is, even though you have kind of these regional transmission organizations and non-regional transmission organizations, we really also have a lot of variation across the RTOs. And if you look at where we've had successful regional transmission planning occur, it's been primarily in this mid-continental, the mid-continent ISO region, the Southwest Power Pool. Texas has had some success. It's this middle corridor. In the East, there's been a lot of conflict, smaller scale reliability and economic transmission projects, but a lot of challenges in getting longer distance transmission projects put in there. And in the West, because there's no regional setting, it's really fragmented, and there's been a lot of challenges in transmission planning. So it's kind of looking at this middle area, and it's like, what have they done well? And I think Elizabeth mentioned, this is an area that doesn't really have aggressive renewable or ambitious renewable portfolio standards, but it's been really successful in bringing on wind resources and building the transmission that's needed to do that. And so there's differences across these areas that I would argue have a lot to do with the business model structure and the relationship between the federal regional transmission organizations and the state public utility regulatory commissions. In the East, their states are far more restructured with retail competition and less direct relationships between the RTOs and the state utility regulators. In this middle corridor, the utilities have remained largely vertically integrated, and the states have been delegated formal responsibility to participate with the regional transmission organization on transmission planning and cost allocation. And I think that's been key to their success there. So with that kind of background, I'm going to talk then a little bit more directly about what's going on in the West in the hydropower system. That blank area that you could see on the previous slide is actually slowly filling up with regional organizations that are less than a full optimized market. You have on the left a Western Resource Adequacy Program that's been stood up specifically to do resource planning and has been driven in large part by these entities in the Pacific Northwest in thinking about the challenges that they're facing right now in managing the hydroelectric system. The figure on the right shows an energy imbalance market that has been in place for nearly 10 years now and is being expanded right now to include day-ahead market services. And so what you're seeing in the West is, rather than creating an organization that covers all of the functions of a regional transmission organization. These separate organizations are being pieced out, and there still isn't an organization looking at transmission. And so that question of how we can do transmission in the West and how we can organize it around this hydro system is something that I've been interested in looking at. So this gives you a sense of the region with the hydroelectric system. The Columbia River Basin is this massive hydroelectric system that people here at least describe as the most complicated hydroelectric system in the world. The federal, the system as a whole involves 15,000 miles of transmission lines and 300 hydroelectric projects across the entire system. The Bonneville Power Administration markets power from 31 large federal dams, and that's what you can see on this map. That is a federal power marketing organization that has a whole bunch of different charges. It markets this power to our rural areas across the West at preferential prices. So our electric co-ops and our municipal utilities, and there are a lot of them in this Pacific Northwest area, they weren't electrified by investor-owned utilities, and they're supported by this system, which for a long time has allowed them to have really low-cost clean power. For the first time in 20 years, this region is now facing tight energy supplies. In addition, the growth of solar in particular in California, but the growth of renewable resources across the West has really changed the value of this system. The transmission is set up to send this low-cost hydropower south to California in the spring when we have a lot of hydropower and into the summer. California really no longer needs that power, and the Bonneville Power Administration has been struggling for several years to kind of figure out the economics of how it can change when it provides power and be used for different purposes, being used for ramping flexibility and being used for storage, which these dams weren't really, a lot of them not designed for storage, but the value of the hydropower for storage is something that they're looking at. With all of these changes in the resources, the region as a whole is increasingly relying on this long distance transportation. In addition, climate change is exacerbating these constraints. There's a lot of uncertainty about what hydro resource is going to be available and facing drought in this area. And there's a continued decline in the salmon fishery, which is very salient to people across the region and something that it has been talked about for decades, but even just this week, President Biden met with the Nez Perce and committed to really looking carefully at removing these lower Snake River dams, which are kind of in the middle of this system and would open up some fisheries areas. So this hydro system is really increasingly under stress and kind of looking at how it can respond. The surrounding utilities are also realizing that they have been, for 20 years, just assuming that there was going to be power in a bilateral market that they were going to be able to buy. And there's been a real wake-up call in just the past couple of years that power might not be there, and they might go out to buy on the bilateral market and there might not be anything there. And that was the impetus for that Western Resource Adequacy program that's now being, or actually was just approved by FERC, and they're standing that up. So with all of this and really this need to think about transmission in a different way, one aspect that I think has been interesting and I thought tied into today's conversation was the discussion about offshore wind in the West. And so I'm going to show this slide. I think Elizabeth probably showed this as well. But in the United States, the floating offshore wind represents about 2/3 of the potential. And on the West Coast, the offshore wind potential is really primarily this floating offshore wind technology. The best resources on the West Coast are kind of right in this area where California and Oregon come together, and you'll see there is an auction that occurred lower down on the coast, but there's a lot of focus in this area in thinking about, at least that's where the best resource is. And so you see attention being directed towards what that might look like for these utilities and for the hydroelectric system, which I think is kind of interesting. So the other thing I want to say, just kind of while I have this slide up, if you look at this, Washington, Oregon, and California all have really these ambitious clean energy policy goals that are creating challenges throughout the West and driving a lot of this interest to look at where should they be bringing on the offshore wind. It's really coming from those policy challenges that or policy goals that they've put into place. Really quickly, I'll just acknowledge that the floating offshore wind on a global installed capacity is very, very small. This is something that, you know, is just being stood up. And I think the questions about what it might look like on the West Coast are really important questions to be asked. If you look at here, this is a kind of zoomed in picture of the West Coast opportunities for offshore wind in Oregon. And so it's showing in these two areas designated call areas for offshore wind. And Oregon has legislation that has asked the state to plan for the development of offshore wind, and they have a planning goal of up to 3 gigawatts of floating offshore wind by 2030. So it's not a procurement goal, but it's a planning goal that they're looking at. California also has kind of a similar planning goal for 2 to 5 gigawatts by 2030. And these are things that they've been looking at to help them meet their policy goals, but also some of the attraction in the West is thinking about how this could remove some of the wildfire hazard and risks that have been really challenging in the area. Of course, the on-site storage with hydrogen, this complementarity with variable renewable resources, and the value you get from that higher capacity factor of the offshore wind is something that people are trying to look at and build into the planning. And this complementarity with the hydro resources has been something that's gained particular attention, where they could really reserve the hydropower system for load flexibility on the system and balance the system a little more with the high capacity factor of the offshore wind. So those are the things that have caught people's attention. But if you look at what this looks like in this area, floating offshore wind projects in this region are really too large for these utilities that serve the Pacific Northwest. Again, we don't have a regional organization. These utilities aren't able to really plan for and take in that kind of size of energy. The best resources in this area are also areas with limited transmission capacity, unlike a lot of the coastal areas that are talking about offshore wind. This kind of Northern California, Oregon coast does not have a lot of large cities on it. The cities are kind of removed from and further inland. And that creates another transmission issue for the area. And so all of this development of the resources, support, the transmission infrastructure, it's going to need to leverage complementarities across resources, requiring regional planning for this transmission. That's going to need to take a larger organization than the current size of organizations that do regional planning. and it's going to require cooperative power offtake agreements. So in the West, I'll show you, this is kind of the jurisdictions that are doing planning within this area. There's 6 investor-owned utilities, 150 consumer-owned utilities, 2 tribal utilities, and this federal power marketing authority. Overlaying this, there is a federally required transmission planning organization, but at this time, really what it's doing is compiling the planning documents that are coming out of all these different entities. And so you really have this, if you're looking at potential for offshore wind to come into the system, you have this resource and transmission planning mismatch, which really just kind of amplifies a lot of the transmission planning problems that the West is already having. And so just kind of to look broadly and kind of step back at kind of these broader transmission challenges that they're facing. You know, the US, we don't have a national transmission planning authority, and our current transmission processes within those regional transmission organizations really have failed to coordinate transmission expansion with the public and private clean energy goals that are becoming more and more important in our system. They also have insufficient time horizons for the types of things that we're looking at. Most often they're using 10 years. The beneficiary pays issues are things that require negotiation and coordination across the different entities that are involved. And there's a lot of differences in methods and assumptions and metrics that are going on underlying the different jurisdictions that are doing some of this planning, and it's hard to do comparative work and look at if you're going to try to go across RTOs or go into some of these non-regional transmission organization areas. And I think what's important to recognize, and what's interesting to me, is that, you know, many of these challenges, they're really embedded in tariffs and institutional designs. To really address these is going to take time and work, and are things that need to be focused on now. And we're at a moment where a lot of people are starting to think about this, but how do we encompass the challenges and the potential technologies that might be coming on? How do we think about bringing in large scale generation resources like offshore wind? Well, we're also thinking about what's the potential of distributed energy resources. How can we look at remote and rural areas and protect them from wildfires in some of the ways that Australia has been thinking about, where, you know, instead of undergrounding all of the lines, you guys are really taking an interesting approach to that. So I think it's a really important time to be thinking about how we put this together and what these processes are at the national level to think about revising our transmission planning approaches. Regional and inter-regional transmission planning for what our future resource mix is necessary, and these transition decisions need to be proactive and long-term. But the way the difference between the regulation of the federal wholesale market and the authorization of these regional transmission organizations is grounded in our Federal Power Act, which is focused on reliability and affordability, and the possibility of having just and reasonable rates. It's really through a lens of technology neutrality. And so you have that constraint on how those organizations look at the problems, where at the same time you have states that are really looking at a wide range of policy goals. And this question that's being discussed right now is, can within the construct we have, the legal constructs we have for the regional transmission organizations, consider the future planning goals that both the state governments have in the United States, as well as many private clean energy goals among our utilities, and can we take those into account in our transmission planning processes in a better way? And I would argue that the states should have an expanded and formalized role in these transmission planning and transmission cost allocation studies. I think that delegation of authority that happened in the Midwest region of the United States has demonstrated to be a successful way to negotiate the interface between state and federal authority. I think there may be a different way that emerges in the West as these organizations grow, but I think thinking about what that interface between state and federal authority is around transmission and planning and cost allocation is really critical. And then this last slides are just some of the ideas. This is really ongoing research for me, some of the things I'm interested in. I'll just kind of highlight the second one, really kind of thinking about how you could look at multi-objective management of this hydropower system in a different way, and think about both the deployment of really large-scale generation and long-distance transmission in a changing climate, along with this question of how do we look at decentralizing our resources and empowering some of our local communities that really want to, these municipal and cooperative utilities that have been constrained in long-term contracts with this large-scale hydropower system. Those communities are looking, many of them, to have more flexibility. And how can you allow those communities to have more distributed, community-owned resources as you're kind of building this backbone of transmission? So I'll kind of leave it with that. Thank you very much.
I don't think I'll ever complain about our grid planning system ever again. Having looked at that structure. I didn't think there would be possibly a worse one, but I think I've just found it. Does anyone have a quick question for Stephanie? Stunned into silence, into the horrors of your grid planning system, basically. But thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here and being with us. So thank you very much. Our next speaker, or we've got two speakers. Are you presenting jointly? Yeah, excellent. We've got Dr. Cameron Kelly and we've got Geordie Pettit from the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, and they're going to be presenting on green hydrogen projects and what that actually means for ARENA and going forward. And we're very lucky. Cam's got a PhD. Geordie is currently doing one with Tina. And you had Cam as well. This is just another example showing you the value of PhDs in higher education, and that you can have interesting roles in the sector as well. So don't think that a PhD. Anyway, handing over to you.
So are we standing, Penny, or are we sitting? Or
whatever you would like.
But we do a dance as well? Or?
That would be fabulous. So
yeah. So thank you so much. Is that the clicker? Is it? Great. Pleasure to be here. Penny, fabulous session. Well done you for hosting such a great event. I mean, unfortunately, I missed the session today, but all accounts, the whole session symposium has been fantastic. So probably well overdue. So well done. Yeah. So we're going to just give a very brief overview as to some of the work that we at ARENA are doing in this slightly vexed space of green hydrogen. Seems to be a polarizing topic now more than ever. Everyone has a view. We'll give you our views, not to say that they're necessarily correct, but it's the view that we have at the moment based on the work that we're doing. They say that in property, it's all about location, location, location. I would suggest in hydrogen, it's all about offtake, offtake, offtake. And we'll get more into that. Geordie's going to unpick that because that's a really big, interesting topic. And Geordie gets to do more of the interesting stuff. So he's going to talk about the bankability of offtake projects, offtake agreements, I should say, and what makes an offtake agreement bankable for the likes of us versus an offtake agreement for a more traditional renewable energy project. I find that really quite interesting. But Geordie's going to I get to talk to you about the boring sort of more boring big picture stuff. We just have to do a very brief intro on ARENA, and this will be very good. We were set up many, many moons ago under Julia Gillard, and the agency has suffered a number of near-death experiences, some of which were quite public. Not going to go into them now, but suffice to say, Now in the agency, and I've been there, this is my 6th year, it's probably, and I have this from people who've been there a decade, it's probably the best time to be there now. And I'm not going to go to the reasons why, you can probably guess why. Yeah, this is an interesting, you can't quite see the top green box figure there, but that refers to a ratio of 1 to 3 broadly. So, you know, a lot of content on this slide in terms of the dollars that we've invested in projects over the last decade. But what I find most interesting from this slide, apart from the headline big figure up the top there in the pale blues, that green figure 1 to 3 is sort of, that's the leverage that we try to look in terms of catalysing private investment. So, you know, for every government funded taxpayer dollar, we're looking to catalyse or incentivise private sector's contribution of around about 3. So triple what we are putting into it. We're confident we can get that up over time, but that's kind of where it's at. There's been a lot of discussion about why do we invest in renewable hydrogen? You know, why all of the big fuss around renewable hydrogen? Again, a lot of people have a view. We'll just talk through that now. The IEA produced a very interesting report back in 2021. I think this document comes from, where it talks about you know, what we need to do from a global perspective to get to net zero by 2050. And I know there's been some commentary around, you know, what do we need to get to in terms of investment to get to the government's recently legislated emission reduction goals by 2030, which is sort of 80 odd months away, or even less. So really 2050 is not that far. If we focus on green hydrogen, namely hydrogen that is produced from renewable energy, predominantly solar at this stage, through this process of electrolysis, the application of electric current to water, you'll find that this report and others talks about, well, where's the main application for that at the moment? So we're going to talk about this thing called steam methane reforming, SMR. So SMR is a well-proven technology. It's used the world over, and it's the process by which natural gas is then converted into hydrogen. It is fairly carbon intensive, and so the idea is that when you produce renewable hydrogen, you're producing the hydrogen stream from renewable energy, so therefore there's no carbon emission. The main process at the moment, as the slide suggests here, is ammonia, but there's this really, really big opportunity around those traditionally hard to abate sectors such as green steel and aluminium. We'll talk more about that. But the big point here is that at the moment, there is this enormous cost differential. The fossil fuel way to get into hydrogen at the moment versus the clean way of getting to hydrogen, there's a differential of 4, 5 or 6 times in terms of cost. Previous government talked about getting us to a target of $2 a kilo or under. At the moment, we're well above that. Somewhere in the order of perhaps 7, 8 in the market. So somehow we need to get down to $2 a kilo and even less as quickly as possible. So how do we do it? Whilst we're on the topic of demand, again, I'm just going to quote a couple of figures from the IEA because I think they're quite interesting. A lot of people talk about this enormous demand for hydrogen and what are the forecasts in terms of what does, you know, demand for hydrogen look like over the next 10, 20 years. The IEA says, well, look, we're around about 94 megatons now, so just under 100. They're saying that that's probably going to double within the next 7, 8 years up to 2030. And then if you take it out to 2050, it goes up to almost 500, so 450 to 500 megatons. If you focus on that 2030 figure, about 1/3, the IEA says, will be produced using the electrolysis process. So we at ARENA are focused on, well, how can we support projects that use electrolyzers, big electrolyzers that, at least for the early projects that we supported, never existed before, and what does the price look like in terms of the levelized cost of energy to actually deploy those electrolyzers properly. The pie chart is interesting. You can see that most of the demand at the moment is made up of refining, as in oil refining, and ammonia. So sort of 2/3. And then if you project that out to 2030, you see that there's this big jump that's projected for iron and steel. Okay, so that's the other big opportunity that we're looking at. How do we decarbonise those hard-to-abate sectors like the steel fabrication process and the aluminium smelting process? So we've got a couple of projects in both those sectors ongoing now, but it's early days. Just unpacking the demand profile a little bit more, you'll see there's a map really of all of the different projects that are going on in Australia at the moment. The only one that I would draw your attention to is the one over there in WA, the Yarra Pilbara project. That's a project that we did, we closed it 2 years ago now, 18 months ago. And that was with Yarra, the off-taker. You can see where they are in the Pilbara. And the sponsor for that was Engie. So it was a well-publicised project. It probably at the time was Australia's first large-scale green hydrogen project. Enormously difficult to close in terms of reaching financial close. That project had a number of near-death experiences like ARENA. It seems that everything that we do at ARENA seems to have near-death experiences and then we are resurrected again. The problems with that project, too numerous to mention, but it was done during COVID as well. So we had all sorts of issues in terms of supply chain, delivery risk with the EPC contractor, working in a very remote site like that as well. Of course, the net result of that project is to produce green ammonia, which of course is then exported. So that was an export play because you've got fabulous export facilities just on the coast near there. So that's the intention of that project. Not to say that all of the early large-scale green hydrogen projects play to an export sort of idea, but at least that one did. And one of the big reasons why that was focused on export is because the infrastructure for both exporting green ammonia and then receiving it into import terminals overseas, it's already quite well established. Okay. One of the things the Europeans are grappling with at the moment is how do they repurpose a lot of their existing LNG import infrastructure around Europe and repurpose that for receiving things like green ammonia and green hydrogen in the future. So there's a lot of work going on in Europe around that sort of space. This is an interesting slide. So this is really ARENA's take on what we see the process for moving from very early stage R&D, so sort of research and development hydrogen projects that we supported back in 2018, 2019, where we provided funding to a bunch of universities all around Australia and said, show us your smarts in terms of developing the R&D and the smarts associated with developing green electrolyzers and this whole new thing of green hydrogen. So that was quite successful. Out of that spun off a lot of really new and interesting entities, including an organisation called HySATA, and we'll talk more about HySATA from the University of Wollongong in a moment. But you can see the sort of trajectory here, and the timeframes are actually quite compressed. So, those early sort of demonstration projects, small scale, less than 1 megawatt back in 2018-19. Then as you move to where we are now, 22, 23, those pre-commercial scale 10 megawatt to 40 megawatt projects, including the Yuri Yarra project in the Pilbara that I was just talking about. That involves a 10 megawatt electrolyzer. Of course, now, jump forward 18 months, 2 years, the electrolyzers are getting far, far bigger, but we had to start somewhere. We gave a funding round into that one. So there's another one, possibly two big green hydrogen projects that we're looking as part of that same funding round. Then, as you move forward out to 2025, you start moving towards the very large scale commercial projects where it starts to get interesting. You start to have meaningful contribution to that sort of net zero ambition that the IEA is talking about. So when we talk about ARENA funding, what are we really talking about? Where we're trying to plug that differential gap. I think I mentioned at the start of the conversation that at least at the moment, producing green hydrogen via electrolysis is enormously expensive, 4 or 5 or even 6 times more expensive than forming. It's about plugging that gap with, quite frankly, blunt grant funding. It's not a particularly elegant instrument to plug the gap, but it's all we've got at the moment. The other countries around the world are approaching it slightly differently. I mean, I'm sure other people have spoken to you about the impact of the IRA in the US, and some of the wonderful CFD schemes that some of the European jurisdictions have done. Early days for us in Australia yet, we still are not there, and there are some discussions now about what might a federal CFD or capacity investment support mechanism look like at a federal level. Not to step on the toes of the wonderful work that New South Wales has already done, with their LTESs, and there was someone who spoke yesterday about the LTESs. If you want to read a really, really amazing contract, read the LTESa. It is amazing. Yeah, and this is another one that we're working on at the moment, the Gibson Island renewable ammonia project with FFI. So there's a lot of interest in this space, and with literally every month, there's more and more proposals coming to us. I've talked a lot already about some of the points in this slide. What I find interesting about producing green hydrogen projects compared to more traditional renewable energy assets like solar and wind. I mean, ARENA did a very successful funding round for large-scale solar back in 2016, 17, 18. So I joined ARENA in 18, must have done. I missed that one. And, really, the result of that funding round for those 11 large-scale solar projects was that effectively put large-scale solar on the map for Australia. Prior to that, everyone said solar's too hard, it's uncommercial, we can't do it. ARENA jumped in, chucked in a bunch of money. That crowded in a lot of concessional and commercial debt alongside us. And then you have a sector of commercial solar that is now standing on its own 2 feet, a really, really good success story. We think we can probably, we'd like to do a similar success story with green hydrogen, but it's a very early stage at this stage. We're trying to do the same thing with large-scale batteries at the moment, particularly the grid forming and smart batteries. That's another conversation, but we think that we can try and get to the same trajectory for green hydrogen. The other point here is that for the solar farm projects that I mentioned, they have a significantly lower OPEX than the long-term sort of green hydrogen projects. The problem with the green hydrogen projects, you've got really big upfront capex, and then you've got really big ongoing OPEX as well. So you've almost got like a double whammy you need to do. A lot of content on this slide. What is slightly disturbing about this slide, if you cast your eyes all the way over to the right, you'll see Australia. And like the naughty child in the schoolroom, Australia has lots of red crosses. Whereas all the other, not all, but most of the other countries have less red crosses. So you get my picture, we're coming to this late. So, for all the different targets that have been legislated or in the process of being legislated to support a green hydrogen economy built up, Australia is unquestionably coming to the party a bit late. So I think we've started, but albeit we're a bit late. Just a quick canter through some of the projects that are reaching financial close across the continent at the moment. This is a bit out of date, but you can see there the Pilbara one in WA that I talked about with Engie and Yarra. But there's a whole lot of other ones. You can see the Gibson Island one in Queensland over on the right. That's the other one I mentioned. There's a lot of projects going on. A very small minority have come to us for support, but we think that over time more and more will come to us for support. I'm not going to spend too much time about CFDs. Just it's a bit of a vexed topic at the moment. It's being considered closely by the federal government at the moment, particularly in light of the speed of the transition that's going on within Australia at the moment. How do you effectively support and firm this rapidly increasing penetration of distributed renewable energy all over the country in a reliable and cost-effective way? The Energy Security Board pondered that question for years, and look, as I said, New South Wales has done a terrific job, in my view, with their LTESs, and they've had a lot of interest in the Central West around the res. I personally think that that's a really good model, and if the federal government wants to do something similar, then I think that's a great idea. But that's for the federal government to decide, not me. But if something like that goes ahead, my only view is don't reinvent the wheel. Have a look at what a very successful jurisdiction like New South Wales has already done or is in the process of doing. What about a CFD for renewable hydrogen? Well, I mean, there's precedent for that overseas. I know that there's some thoughts about whether going forward we need to move to something like, you know, the production tax credits that the US has, rather than just blunt grant instruments. But again, that's for consideration for people that are way above my pay grade. I mentioned HiSATA a couple of minutes ago. I only bring this to your attention because they're a really fabulous company. This is we did some interesting work at the University of Wollongong years and years ago during that R&D round. HiSATA was a spin-off out of University of Wollongong, including one of the people who used to head up strategy for ARENA. And they've come up with this amazing technology, this capillary-fed electrolysis cell, and there's a diagram of it there. But the efficiencies that they're getting are quite breathtaking. You know, up around 97, 98%. Whereas at the moment, it's sort of in that 20, 30, 40% tops range. So if this comes to pass, it's potentially a game changer in terms of, you know, bringing the cost of electrolysis down and therefore bringing the cost of green hydrogen down. And that's me. So Geordie's now going to give you a much more interesting talk about bankability.
Thanks, Cam. And just to note that that L test is definitely not homework, 160 pages, so you've got to be pretty keen to read that one. So ARENA's been in the renewable hydrogen space for a while now. So probably since, as Cam was saying, around kind of 2018, 2019, we started looking at a few feasibility programs, getting funding out for R&D, and then that resulted in our deployment funding round. So this one was last year. So we had about $100 million to distribute, and the goal was to get 10 megawatt electrolyzers or fit for export electrolyzers up and going around Australia. So it's been a bit of a journey. A few of the projects haven't actually reached financial close yet. So as Cam was kind of alluding to, the Ongi project in WA, that one reached financial close already. So that one's a 10 megawatt electrolyzer. We'll talk about that one in a second. ATCO hasn't gone ahead as yet. The AGIG one, which you can see on the left there, that one's a gas blending project in Albury, in Victoria, and basically they're trying to blend quantities of 15% renewable hydrogen into the gas grid. So it'll be kind of a first of its kind project down in Victoria there. That one's nearing financial close, but it kind of gives you a bit of a broad picture of just how long it takes from feasibility 2018, 2019, all the way up 21, getting funding, and then in now 22, 23, starting to kind of actually break ground. So it's quite a process. And yeah, I guess the benefit of ARENA is we can kind of bridge the bankability gap between feasibility studies and getting something on the ground. So moving ahead to a round that we've got currently going. So this one was a result of discussions between the Australian and German governments for a number of years. So there was a MOU in 2020 that basically set the platform for these discussions. So it's formed into the Highgate program, which basically looks to get a partnership going between the German and Australian governments on a couple of projects, so that both the knowledge sharing, which is a big part of ARENA's mandate, can be shared between both governments, and we're starting to get a bit of a kind of a supply chain or a kind of industry going between the two countries. Germany's quite advanced in their demand. So they've got a CFD scheme, which Cam was alluding to, and basically through that, it's called H2 Global. They're looking to get a lot of demand of renewable hydrogen going. And Australia could be one of those that's best placed to be an exporter of green hydrogen and fulfill those demand profiles. So as Cam was alluding to, there's quite a few challenges when getting these projects up. Offtake, I think is quite right. When you're looking to get financing for a project, you need to have all of your kind of debt, or in case of ARENA, grant funding locked in, so that you go back to your board, go back to your sponsors and say, hey, we've got the money ready to go. So I think one of the best examples we've got is one that we've touched on already. So it's the Uri project in WA. So this one was quite a process, 2 or 3 years. So we've got the, as you can see down the bottom there, the feasibility back in 2020, about $1 million of ARENA funding to try and see if it was going to work. So the ammonia plant is already there. So we're looking just to kind of retrofit this existing ammonia plant with the capacity to produce renewable hydrogen and to offset some of the carbon emissions in the profile of that ammonia. So great news, we've hit the ground running. We're now producing 625 tonnes of hydrogen once it's built onto the facility. It's also supported by solar PV and a battery storage system. So a couple of key challenges just to note there. So in 2020, when this first started, it was the start also of their project approval timeline. Now, a good thing to remember when you're looking at a kind of first of a kind technology is sometimes, or most of the time, the law actually hasn't caught up. So in many of these jurisdictions, we're seeing Victoria, WA, Queensland, South Australia, they're all having to update their gas laws and also update their planning frameworks to allow for a project that produces renewable hydrogen into the networks, making sure that consumer law is up to date and fit for purpose. So that's a big chunk of work that gets done in parallel to these projects kind of getting up. And then, of course, the most critical one is the offtake agreement. So in this project, it was Yarra Fertilizers was the offtaker. So basically, they took a contract that you would have seen kind of in a standard form for in PPAs, for example, where you've got someone who's going to build a solar farm and then basically guarantee a fixed term price for that product for a number of years. Of course, the difficulty with something like renewable hydrogen is there isn't a price for it. So having a bankable project is quite difficult when the two parties are trying to butt their heads together and work out a price. So basically, a couple of the key things that we looked at in terms of being the financier or the grant funder was the pricing model. So the take or pay principles in the contracts. We also looked at the performance guarantees associated with the electrolyzer. So basically, a lot of the time, if you're getting an electrolyzer or any kind of piece of kit in from overseas, the performance guarantees won't align with Australian standards. So making sure that that is harmonised is quite key. And a few other challenges. EPC contractor in a market where you're trying to fit an electrolyzer onto an existing ammonia plant, not a lot of people can do it. Not a lot of companies can come in and build that at the moment. So that's quite a challenge. And then, of course, an independent certifier. So basically, the way that ARENA funding works is we pay out in grant milestones. So we'll kind of, if a certain part of the project has been built, we can get independent certifier in there to say, yes, that's been done, tick. But again, because it's such a new technology, it's hard to get a company that knows what they're doing. So that's another challenge. Time, I'll skip forward. This is quite a key variable in the renewable hydrogen space. So guarantee of origin has been around it's been in discussions for a while now in Australia. Back in early December 21, we started looking at consulting with industry about what is the best kind of practice for certifying a green hydrogen or a green product more generally. So we've got kind of two products at the moment that are looking to be introduced to the market. So we've got the product Go, which will be attached at this stage just to ammonia to make sure that it's green, it's ready to go. It can be traded as a green product. And the Rego, which is replacing the LGCs and STCs in the LRED. The most important thing with a guarantee of origin, noting that a lot of the projects we've kind of talked about are export facing, is that there's harmonisation with other international schemes. So if we're looking to certify, an emissions profile of product, we will look at the way it was produced, who's going to be using it, what the transport kind of emissions are associated with that product, and capturing that into kind of a figure. So we can kind of tag that with a green tick. If the importing country doesn't have the same kind of variables, so if they only look at production, such as the US, then there's a mismatch. So it's hard to kind of at this stage see where two countries can come together and be like, yeah, we've got a matching scheme in both countries. This is going to work out well. We're going to certify that your product is green, and we're going to pay a green premium for that product. So it's another challenge. This one's kind of still under consultation, but really interesting space to watch. And yeah, just I guess a few key takeaways from the presentation generally. There's quite a string of renewable hydrogen projects, which is really positive in Australia. So the law is catching up, which is really good to see. But as the table that Ken showed previously, there's still a lot of work to do. Still a lot of red crosses that need a lot of green ticks. And yeah, a few ways to do that is through concessional finance, CFDs, and we've got to keep up with other countries in the space like the US, Germany, other European countries. So it's getting there. I think the work at Arena is trying to bridge the gap at the moment and see if we can move feasibility to export and yeah, hopefully give it business help along the way. Anything else?
Excellent. Thank you very much. I have time for one very quick question. If anyone has.
Well, I was wondering what Arena's opinion is on where, like, the first domestic market for hydrogen or ammonia would be. It's not fertilizer based. That makes sense.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Domestic market for green hydrogen, non-ammonia based, is it?
For hydrogen or ammonia products that's not in the production of fertilizer. So, like, what the first practical uses for the benefit.
Yeah, so I mean, green steel is a good example. So in the processes for the calcination of green steel, hydrogen can be a really good input there. Explosives as well. So hydrogen can be an input to that process. Some other kind of
Aluminium.
aluminium.
Early days. I mean, gas blending as well. But I'm reading some interesting commentary at the moment about some people who don't say gas blending is not the way to go.
Yeah, going in swing takes place. It's just about a crop that.
Yeah,
That was one for
there you go,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So there's all this support, historical support for this notion of gas blending, and it's a good thing to incrementally introduce, you know, a carbon-free product like green hydrogen into existing natural gas networks. But I'm seeing a lot more commentary, and perhaps from Rob as well. I didn't hear Rob's session about, no, this is not a good idea. So maybe there's no PhD topic in this.
Yes. So we have a PhD topic in there somewhere. Thank you very much for that. I really appreciate it. As you can see, we've been very fortunate to get the absolute gurus from Arena here. So thank you. Our next speaker in this session is going to be Professor David Leary from UTS. And he's going to be just shift gears away from, I know we've been talking a lot about offshore and hydrogen and hydropower. And this is just something else that I thought was a really interesting topic that we should be aware of when we're talking about new energy products. So, over to David.
Okay, well, while we're waiting for the slides, just to clarify and follow on what Penny was saying, I am an imposter. I'm not an energy lawyer. My area of expertise is law of the sea and international environmental law. So, although I've done a fair bit of work in relation to offshore renewable energy and ocean energy and wave and tidal energy in particular from a law of the sea perspective, my focus is not, I'm not an energy lawyer, so that's my disclaimer. What I'm going to talk about is the very, very recent development, and so recent that this month that it's actually occurred, is the conclusion of diplomatic negotiations for the BBNJ Treaty. Is there anyone in the room who knows what the BBNJ Treaty is? One person, that's good. I'm not surprised given that you mentioned the law of the sea in your presentation earlier. The reason I say that is because most law of the sea and international environmental lawyers have been living and breathing this treaty negotiations. 25 years or thereabouts it's taken to conclude the treaty. And it looks almost like 2 to 3 months ago that the whole negotiation was going to fall over the heap and it's not going to go anywhere. But we do now have the treaty. So what I'm going to have a talk to you about is the background to the BBNJ process, so you can just understand where it's come from, before talking about 2 areas that I can see potentially, and I say potentially, hypothetically, possibly, will have some impact on renewable energy, and particularly offshore renewable energies, such as wind energy, and or submarine cables associated with offshore renewable energy in its various forms. And the 2 parts of the treaty that are perhaps most relevant are those relating to environmental impact assessment and area-based management tools such as marine protected areas. And then I'll offer you some tentative conclusions in relation to where it's going. And I say very, very tentative. It's still really, really uncertain. But just to set the scene so you understand where we are, and when I started my PhD, I often used to get asked many years ago, what was my PhD? And I said, oh, well, I'm doing my PhD in relation to the deep sea. And the response usually was, the deep sea. That's a really good place for lawyers. We need more lawyers in the deep sea. So a lot of my work throughout my academic career has actually been focused on the deep sea and the high seas. And that's really what we're talking about, not so much the deep sea, but the high seas areas. So essentially all those areas beyond national jurisdiction, outside the exclusive economic zone, and also to a limited extent, the treaty will have some application to the area, capital A, which is the terminology used in the Law of the Sea Convention, principally with respect to submarine cables. So that's where we are. Now, of course, realistically, let's go back, before we talk realistically about the technology, let's go back to where this all came from. For many of you in the room, I know it's ancient history, in fact, for some of you even before you were born. But the whole, this is how long I've been living and breathing BBNJ, the whole impetus for the negotiation of the treaty really goes back to this one person. And his name is Lyle Floker, who's a well-known international environmental lawyer, has worked at the Secretariats of the Biodiversity Convention, Convention on Migratory Species, the IUCN, amongst others. And in an article he published in 1996, he talked about the need for a specific legal regime to regulate access and benefit sharing in relation to genetic resources in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And he observed, quite interestingly, we had a very, very complicated regime that had been negotiated under Part 11 of the Law of the Sea Agreement to deal with mineral resources in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And mining had not yet occurred. And yet, he was arguing there is actually a level of commercial interest in marine genetic resources from these areas, and commercial activities were already occurring. Question though, the scale on which that actually eventuated. So Lyle kicked off this debate with that really interesting article. And around about the same time, we started to see significant discussion in the academic literature, in the NGO community, the IUCN, WWF, amongst others, about issues such as how could we better protect and conserve marine biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction, and what role potentially could marine protected areas and environmental impact assessment play in that sort of scenario. And so we saw effectively a fusion of debate in relation to three key issues: marine genetic resources and their status and their commercial exploitation, marine protected areas in the high seas, which at that time there was no legal mechanism to create them, so spread of the high seas, and environmental impact assessment beyond national jurisdiction, which did not exist until the BBNJ Treaty came along. So it's like the story behind the treaty is a little bit like as Bismarck famously said, there's two things that you don't want to see being made. One is how sausages are made, and the other is how laws are made. And having been involved for a number of years in some of these processes at BBNJ, I can say to you, it's a bit like watching the sausage factory in terms of what's been created. It's been a long and complicated process. But the first big part of that process was in the early 2000s with the creation, and you love this is the United Nations, through the creation, or through the process that was known as UNICLOS, the United Nations Informal Consultative Process on Oceans and Law of the Sea. So the UN's really doing that. But out of UNICLOS came the recommendation to establish a working group on BBNJ. BBNJ working group then in 2011 made recommendations to the UN General Assembly to start a process to negotiate the treaty. So in 2015, the UN General Assembly again was seized with the issue, and in Resolution 69292 agreed to start the formal process for treaty negotiations through the establishment of a PrepCom. And interestingly, the PrepCom really brought those three issues closely together, as I mentioned. And that was biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction, questions of marine genetic resources, area-based management tools, areas, and environmental impact assessment and click-through capacity building, like they do with most of these treaties as well, transfer of technology. So that then became what is known as the package deal approach to negotiations. From the very early stages, it was agreed unless we could bring all those issues into the one treaty, there would be no treaty. And to my surprise, we do have a treaty now that brings all of those into existence. So the PrepCom was established to commence the process. Then in December 2017, in another resolution, the UN General Assembly actually formally called for convening the Intergovernmental Conference, which is the negotiating process, and emphasised again the need for the package. So then over a series of negotiating sessions starting in 2018, concluding on the 4th of March, so only a few weeks ago, a treaty has been negotiated. And it goes to some 54 pages in its current form. So let's now turn to what you're more interested in, the implications of the BBNJ Treaty for Renewable Energy. And I just, a couple of slides, just want to emphasise to illustrate what are the particular areas I'm talking about. One will be, of course, offshore renewable energy, ocean energy, those areas. Not so much the projects themselves that, as you know, will occur in the shallow waters of the territorial sea or some of our out into the PZ. But some of these types of projects could potentially be caught by the BBNJ Treaty if they have an environmental impact in the high seas. Okay, I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, obviously, as we just heard from one of our earlier speakers, things like floating offshore wind farms, very, very experimental technology, and that's a long way off. But theoretically, in the future, if we do have floating wind farms in the high seas, they'll also be caught. But I think the more important areas is in territorial seas. Now, the other side, where I want to show this slide to you, this is just a summary from a publication by Beng et al., where they talk about the NDCs that have been agreed under the Paris Agreement in relation to climate change. And you can see in the ASEAN region in particular, there's quite significant commitments. And that has meant, as a consequence, there is now significant interest in renewable energy in ASEAN. Why that matters for us here in Sydney, of course, is a lot of the discussion about interconnected or intercontinental energy grids and what that might look like in the region. And we saw most recently, of course, and I know the status of some cable is questionable at the moment, at least. But if you think of it in terms of the idea, what's involved in transmitting electricity across 4,500 kilometres below the ocean floor, it's a significant undertaking if it is ever to eventuate. And it is possible to foresee a situation where cables like that will pass across the high seas. So, when will the BBNJ Treaty enter into force? Well, the simple answer is not yet. To start with, although agreement was reached on the text of the treaty on the 4th of March earlier this month, it wasn't formally adopted by the Intergovernmental Conference. Now, my suspicion for that, as to why that is the case, is because the announcement that agreement had been reached came at 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning of the 4th of March, and the negotiations were meant to be concluded by the 3rd. I suspect that there is agreement in principle, but there's maybe a few minor tweaks that are going to have to be made. And that's why the treaty wasn't actually formally adopted at the Government Conference. But it will be at another conference to be held, or another session of that conference to be held later this year. The treaty will then enter into force 120 days after the 60th incident ratification has been lodged. That's going to actually happen pretty quickly, I think. There's a lot of support for the BBNJ Treaty. A lot of countries have got behind it. Australia, I think, will almost definitely ratify the treaty. And the reason for that is we've been so intimately involved. When I say we, I mean both sides of politics, both forms of government in the country have quite strongly supported the negotiations of the BBNJ Treaty. Now, that's all well and good, but for those of you who think back to your undergraduate days when you studied public international law, of course, treaty has no force of law domestically in Australia until Parliament passes enabling legislation through the processes of JSCOP, etc. So that's the first big question. When Australia ratifies and then incorporates the BBNJ Treaty into domestic law, how's it going to be done? Is it going to be part of this wild process we're undergoing at the moment of reform of the EPBC Act? Is it going to be through specific sectoral amendments like the Offshore Electricity Infrastructure Act, which, as we heard earlier on, has such a fantastic environmental impact assessment regime? What will that mean? We don't know. Now, a couple of provisions of the treaty worth noting. So it's in 12 parts. The most important parts for today, of course, part 1, general definition, scope of application. Part 4, an environmental impact assessment. I'll talk about first, and then marine protected areas. So here's the text of the treaty. I think what's really interesting for those of you who are environmental lawyers as well as energy lawyers, you'll recognise so much of the terminology embodied in this treaty. So we talk about the polluter pays principle, the ecosystem approach, best available scientific, best available science and scientific information to guide decision making. The curious one here, though, is in D, principles to guide the application of the treaty include the precautionary principle or the precautionary approach. Right? And that's a really good, you know what that means? You know where I'm going with this? This reflects, of course, the division between different countries and their attitude to whether it is a precautionary principle, which I think we would argue in Australia, and certainly is on a Chief Justice Preston has been a strong proponent of the precautionary principle and stuff with respect to excellent work in terms of advancement of that principle, whereas maybe in North America, more familiar with the precautionary approach. So that's going to be interesting to see how that's going to play out.
How does that differ in practice?
Well, that's the question. That's the question. I mean, I guess the precautionary principle would be a principle that guides what we must do and how we respond to a certain degree of uncertainty.
Right.
An approach
Comes in, so if you take Dawkins,
Yeah.
principal policy rules, principle comes in at the principle level, which then guides policy, which then guides law, whereas the approach only comes in at the regulatory rule kind of, we are going to utilise a precautionary approach and it would be legislated, but it would not be an overarching principle that guides the entire policy and framework. It would be systemic. It would be just like, it would be in, you know, the Newcastle offshore area, but not in, you know, because we already know about Victoria. Because we've done patrolling. It's really bad. It is.
alternatives. And of course, the question then is, which one is appropriate and where?
Yeah, we
Okay.
use that for safety, environmental we use either a la or, and then they go on. So,
Look, I'm not sure where this has come from, but it certainly stuck out to me straight away when.
well, it all came from the same place. It's trail smelter.
Yeah, well, it all comes from Charles Melbourne.
Yeah, but this is the interesting thing.
Accepting there's a number of subsequent decisions in international courts and tribunals that have actually said the precautionary principle is a principle of customary international law.
If the US is going to ratify this, if the US is going to sign and ratify, and this is the US because they don't have to, they're not an impulse anyway.
No, they're not a party to impulse. They've been very active in the negotiations for the BBNJ Treaty.
So that might have been for any modest state, that's probably what it's for.
I'm not expecting the US to ratify it, have to sign on to it. They're not going to do that. Well, every time it's new president. Anyway, just moving on. So the general objectives, of course, of part 4 is to deal with environmental impact assessment. So that's strategic environmental impact assessment across the whole area of ocean space and the various uses, and specific environmental impact assessment of individual projects. But the real interesting provision is contained in Article 22, which sets up the circumstances when so if you're going to have a planned activity under your jurisdictional control, so you could say that's your flag state of a vessel that's going to go out and do something, which takes place in areas beyond national jurisdiction, then you as a state have to assess the environmental impact. More importantly, though, when a party, the jurisdictional controller of planned activity, that is to be conducted in areas within national jurisdiction. So we're talking about in the territorial sea or in the EEZ. So if you're doing something in the territorial sea or the EEZ, which may cause substantial pollution of or significant and harmful changes to the marine environment in areas beyond national jurisdiction, then that party shall ensure an environmental impact assessment. So now your environmental impact assessment on one reading of Article 22 will require for projects within national jurisdiction, so wind farm, whatever that has a significant environmental impact, I'll come to that in a moment, to be assessed for its impact in areas beyond national jurisdiction, on top of everything else.
Says Montara and the West Timor sea fishermen and impact.
Well, this is the really interesting thing. The two most environmentally challenging issues in the ocean are fisheries and deep sea mining, neither of which will be caught by this for most aspects of their experience. So what it means then, although the focus of the BBNJ Treaty is on the area beyond national jurisdiction, potentially a project, a project within areas a project within areas of national jurisdiction that has an environmental impact outside of national jurisdiction, so on the high seas, will be caught by the treaty. Now, the big unknown, of course, at the moment is the trigger for environmental impact assessment. And the trigger is more than a minor or transitory effect on the marine environment, or the effects of the activity are unknown or poorly understood, hence the relevance of the proportionate principle. More importantly, how are we going to conduct environmental impact assessment, what's going to need to be assessed, etc., is going to be subject to guidelines to be issued by a newly created scientific technical body. And we'll need to consider cumulative impacts and have a screening process. Now, and there's a process of public consultation in relation to all those VIOs. The interesting thing about the process for environmental impact assessment is an initial threshold trigger under Article 30, which requires states to screen, first of all, to see whether they need an environmental impact assessment, and then make publicly known the fact that they've determined, yes, it's needed, or no, it's not needed. And other states are then given an opportunity to comment on the need for environmental impact assessment. So state determines what it's going to do in its own areas of national jurisdiction on a renewable energy project. Other states have to be notified that it either has no or does have an impact on areas beyond national jurisdiction. Other states then have an opportunity for a bit of argy-bargy. That's all reviewed by the scientific and technical body. And states are obliged to consider the view. So it's not that the technical and scientific body can actually change the decision or override the decision. But my concern with this in particular is imposing yet another bureaucratic process on an industry that we already know must be moving quicker. And of course, there's all sorts of provisions in terms of ongoing monitoring and review. So what sort of things might potentially trigger the BBNG treaty? Well, much of that depends on the threshold and impact set to be determined by the scientific body, but you can think of things like impact on micro species, be they avian fauna, fish, marine mammals, impact on sites of international significance, impacts on biodiversity beyond the actual construction site. For cables, I think this is the one that's really interesting. It is the potential for noise pollution in relation to surveys. And why that I flagged that in particular is because the International Cable Committee specifically said, we don't want the BBNJ treaty to apply to us. There's no reason it should. And the response of the state parties was, no, it's now going to apply to the laying of cables in areas beyond national jurisdiction, which up until now has been regarded as a high seas freedom under law of sea.
But I mean, that's huge. That's the thing about the, we don't run any rules made for marine animals and fish.
Look, it's a significant controversy over marine mammals and noise. As it
There
is.
is,
I
yeah.
don't know exactly where it's come from. And it may be that we have enough evidence to say there's not enough of an environmental impact to trigger it. Certainly in telecommunications cables, the scientific evidence suggests it has very little environmental impact. Question mark for electricity transmission, that's the same. So the other point worth noting is the treaty now also creates a mechanism for creation of high seas marine protected areas. Now, I'm less concerned about that because we have lots of experience with marine protected areas within areas of national jurisdiction. And a marine protected area does not necessarily mean a no entry zone or a no activity zone. And that's where there's a really important role for marine spatial planning in terms of sorting out what are appropriate activities. But again, there's scientific review by an external body. Some of these bodies still need to actually be established by the competent parties. So yeah, limited impact, I think, as I said. So my conclusions then in relation to this treaty, and I've probably gone way over time. Two main conclusions in relation to the environmental impact assessment. Whether or not the treaty is going to apply to activities in the territorial sea or the exclusive economic zone, I think it's probably unlikely, given the scale of environmental impact we see from offshore renewable energy. But it's a hypothetical we need to be vigilant about. And particularly why I say that is because we don't have any definition of what's minor or transitory impact. We also don't know how states like Australia are going to transpose the treaty into our domestic law. And yeah, that's fine. And I also make the point that I get the need to conserve and protect biodiversity areas beyond national jurisdiction. The BBNJ treaty plugs a huge hole in the law of the sea and international environmental law that's been around for centuries. But we need to make some choices now. This is the unforeseen. Renewable energy offers us the big solution to climate change. Well, it has a big role to play. Do we really want to be imposing even more regulatory burdens on an industry that already works with legal systems that are not necessarily good for it? So I'll just throw that out. And likewise, having seen the UN system internally, I am sceptical about handing more power to a UN mechanism to review these sorts of projects, including a scientific technical body. So the other thing that's a little bit concerning, there is actually a provision in the treaty that makes clear that this is not about extending the jurisdiction of the coastal state. We're not taking it beyond the territorial sea. That's explicit in Article this. But if you're now giving to other states the ability to object to a renewable energy project or indeed any other project within another state's areas of national jurisdiction, it does raise some questions and challenges. Final point, in relation to marine protected areas and area-based management tools, to what extent will we see a sensible management of marine protected areas? I'm reasonably confident about that from everything I've seen of where these proposals have come from. A lot of work's been done by the IUCN in particular. They've really led the charge on high seas MPAs. So I think people who have been involved in the process get how to manage MPAs properly. So on that note, and you couldn't even see my punchline, renewable energy, I'm a big fan. I'll leave it there.